Hello. We were just trying to work out how we got up onto the stage. We managed
Hi,
it without
everyone.
falling. Um, Before we start, can I ask, can I invite you to raise your hand if you work in AI? We won't judge you. I'm just, there's a few. Okay, cool. So you know the score. Can I invite you to raise your hands if you have ever used generative AI? Yeah, I thought as much. Hands up if you've never ever used generative AI. Oh, we have some resistance. Ah, excellent. I'm not judging anyone. I'm just curious. Okay. So, welcome here this evening to the Conduit. I'm Kate. This is Karen. I'm really excited about this. I've followed Karen's work for quite some time. She's a really astute and fearless writer, and it's been such a treat to read her book. She's got a deep knowledge of the technical and of the socio-technical implications of AI, as well as being such a keen observer of Silicon Valley culture. And her book, for many people, is a really eye-opening account of the power that lies in the hands of big tech and the incredible reach that companies have. And I genuinely believe it's one of the most important books of the year, if not the decade. And I don't say that lightly. I think it's super important. So, Karen, you are a journalist covering tech, but you also have a tech background yourself. So, do you want to tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so I took an interesting route into journalism. I studied mechanical engineering at MIT for undergrad. I never conceived of myself as going into journalism or writing about tech. I absolutely thought that I was going to have a traditional tech career. I moved to San Francisco, I joined a startup, I was part of the Silicon Valley scene. And then within a year, I realized that I probably should not be there because I realized the problems that I was really interested in focusing on, which at the time was I was really focused on wanting to figure out how to build technology for mitigating climate change, that was not a profitable problem. And Silicon Valley's model of innovation is really based on what is profitable, and secondary is then what is for the public good. And increasingly, there has become a really great divergence between what is profitable and what is good for society. So that is when I then hopped over into journalism and kind of begrudgingly first started writing about tech because I thought I was leaving the tech world and I didn't really want to write about it anymore. But then I realized very quickly that it was a way for me to continue exploring some of the challenges that I confronted working in the tech industry, and that misalignment of incentives, and trying to think more deeply about how do we actually change our models of innovation to realign different business models towards what is for the public benefit.
Let's jump off of that actually, because your book charts the beginnings of OpenAI as a well-intended non-profit, right through to the more exploitative empire that it's become. And you also trace Sam Altman's own background, including his quite fractured family relationships. Do you think that OpenAI would be what it was without Altman? Because we see the tech bros behavior as almost homogenous in some ways. And, if we swapped someone else in, would it have been the same with someone else at the helm?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question. And first of all, I want to call out Neil Firth, my editor from MIT Technology Review, was the first editor to commission a profile of OpenAI from me. So this book would not exist without him. But yeah, it's an interesting question. So I started taking note of OpenAI back in 2019 when I was still a reporter at MIT Technology Review covering AI. And the reason it intrigued me was because of the nonprofit premise, and also because it positioned itself as a fundamental AI research lab. And MIT Tech Review was very much focused on that. That was my coverage. I covered fundamental AI research coming out of academia and corporate labs. And I feel like, in a way, Altman is very important to understanding the OpenAI story, in the sense that he is a product and animal of Silicon Valley. And so a lot of the ways that OpenAI transformed from a nonprofit to, you could argue, the most capitalistic for-profit in the tech industry today, with, they just raised 40 billion, which is the largest private fundraising amount that's ever been raised, and now with a valuation of $300 billion as a company. That transition really was shepherded by him. And he, for those of you who don't know, his background is quite interesting in that he originally started as a startup founder, And then he became the president of Y Combinator, which is one of the most prestigious startup accelerators in Silicon Valley. And he very much both learned and absorbed and also cultivated a culture within Silicon Valley of this idea of a zero-sum game and winner takes all mentality. And he also cultivated this mindset of you should add zero to everything, add zero to the amount of money you're raising, add zero to the number of users you're aspiring for, and just this aggressive blitz scaling mentality. And so it's really not a surprise that OpenAI now operates very much under this mind frame where it goes for these aggressive fundraises, it goes for aggressive user growth, and really competes in this extremely intense dynamic with all of the other competitors using this winner takes all mentality. That said, I also don't think that if you were to swap Altman with someone else, you would fundamentally fix the problem here, because most likely it would be taken over by someone else from Silicon Valley. And at the end of the day, while Altman is one of those, you could argue, the most extreme manifestation of the canonical Silicon Valley entrepreneurial character, there are plenty more of those people. So yeah, I don't think it would solve the root problem.
And a reminder that in those early nonprofit days, when it was being done for the benefit of humankind, Elon Musk was the one who wanted to protect that nonprofit thing. Elon Musk was the person with the conscience.
So, you know, what's interesting is, like, now that I've been covering the tech industry for a while, and of course I worked in it, people who work in the industry and run the industry, they always have, just as much as they tell stories to the public about what they're doing and try to really create this vision of why it's beneficial, they also tell that story to themselves. And what they tell themselves is potentially even a stronger version of those narratives that we ultimately get into the public. So Elon Musk had a really interesting, I mean, yes, he co-founded OpenAI as a nonprofit with Altman, and he, to this day, positions himself as someone that was very protective of that nonprofit origin and this desire to really create a counter against the Silicon Valley for-profit AI development incentives. And I'm sure he believes that he believed that. And I'm sure that Altman, to this day, still also believes that he is doing everything that he can possibly do for OpenAI's mission, which is to ensure artificial general intelligence benefits all of humanity. And so, you know, both of them are they're both in this interesting, I not very charitably call it self-delusion. Like they really do have to create this story around what they're doing that puts them as the protagonist and also the good guy on this crusade to civilize the world.
And I'll come back to that whole self-delusion thing later, because I think there's something really interesting there. But in regard to the book, the central thesis that the AI industry consists of empires is such a compelling description. And you said, I find only one metaphor that encapsulates the nature of what these AI power players are: empires. During the long era of European colonialism, empires seized and extracted resources that were not their own and exploited the labor of the people they subjugated to mine, cultivate, and refine those resources for the empire's enrichment. So tell us more about that. So for anyone who doesn't know, what are those resources when you talk about the people, the hidden labor there?
Yeah, so the title of my book, Empire of AI, it's not just a nod to the way that Silicon Valley always describes what they're doing as empire building. It really is trying to articulate this argument that we need to think of these companies like OpenAI as new forms of empire in the classical sense. And there's 4 different features that I point to throughout the book that have a parallel between empires of AI, as I call them, and empires of old. The first one being that empires lay claim to resources that are not their own, but they often interpret the rules or redesign the rules to suggest that those resources were always their own. So empires of AI do this by scraping a lot of the data online and suggesting that this was in the public domain and it's perfectly fair game. And they do that by consuming all of the books that have been published and downloading them off of the dark web and saying that this intellectual property is totally fair use. They're using it for purposes beyond what would be protected by copyright. Empires also exploit a lot of labor, as you read through that quote. And empires of AI do this in two ways, both in that they contract a lot of labor in the global south and in economically vulnerable communities to do some of the worst work in the AI development supply chain. So that's data preparation, data cleaning, and also content moderation, which is one of the dimensions that I highlight in one of the chapters, where OpenAI contracted content moderators in Kenya who ended up suffering the same fate as content moderators of social media, deeply traumatized, themselves broken down, their families and communities broken down. But the other way that empires of AI engage in labor exploitation is they're ultimately producing labor automating technologies. OpenAI's definition of artificial general intelligence is highly autonomous systems that outperform humans in most economically valuable work. And so what they're articulating here is that they are ultimately going after things that people do that are usually the way they make money. And that in and of itself leads to exploitation, because as you erode people's ability to bargain at the bargaining table, there will be less workers' rights and more worker exploitation. The third feature of empire is they monopolize knowledge production. So one of the things that's happened in the last 10 years is because these companies have become very, very richly resourced, they're able to offer compensation packages that easily cross over $1 million. And so we've seen the top AI talent in the world shift from academia or independent AI research labs increasingly to these companies. And so most AI research that you encounter today, which is the foundation for public understanding of what this technology can do and what its limitations are, is driven by what is good for these companies, and things that are inconvenient for the companies are censored. And the last feature is that empires always have this narrative that there are good empires and there are evil empires. So the reason why they, the good empire, need to be an empire in the first place and engage in all this resource extraction, labor exploitation, is ultimately because they have to be strong to beat back the evil empire. And throughout the book, I document how OpenAI's conception of who is the evil empire shifts depending on what's convenient. Originally, it was Google. Now, increasingly, it's China. But the narrative is always the same, that if they do not, as the good empire, have unfettered access to all of these resources, then humanity is going to risk going to hell. But if you allow them to do whatever they want, then they will be able to civilize the world, bring modernity and progress to everyone, and humanity will finally have a chance to go to heaven.
So kind. It's so benevolent. And you did a lot of legwork for this book. So you were on the ground. There was actual detection going on of what was there. Tell us a little bit about the kind of things you were doing.
Yeah, one of the things that I really felt was important in doing this book right was not just telling the story in Silicon Valley, because ultimately this is a global technology and you really don't start seeing that logic of empire, what I was arguing, unless you go far and away from Silicon Valley. So I did a lot of reporting trips. I went to Kenya, I went to Colombia, I went to Chile, Uruguay, to really document how the supply chain of AI development is hugely harming communities, economically vulnerable communities. So I mentioned I went to Kenya to interview content moderators that OpenAI had contracted. And they contracted them during a time when OpenAI was shifting away from its fundamental AI research lab orientation towards a commercialization focus. And what they realized was, if they put their text generation machines that can spew anything into the hands of millions of users, it would not last very long as a popular product. It would turn into a PR crisis. And in fact, in 2016, there's this infamous case where Microsoft did exactly that. It was called the Tay chatbot. And within hours, the Tay chatbot went totally started spewing awful things, hateful
racist,
things.
It was sexist, it was sending dick pics. It was really not good.
Yeah, it was not good at all. And so OpenAI said, we don't want to do that. We want to create a content moderation filter that will wrap around all of our models So ultimately, it can block any of this abusive, harmful generations before it reaches the user. And so they contracted these Kenyan workers to build that filter. And what that meant was these workers had to weed through reams and reams of the worst text on the internet, as well as AI generated text, where OpenAI was prompting the models to imagine the worst text on the internet. And then the workers were putting these into detailed taxonomies. Is this hate speech? Is this harassment? Is this violent content? Is this sexual content? To what degree is this violent content? Is this sexual content that involves abuse of children? And one of the workers that I interview, Mofa Okinye, he was the one that taught me that it's not just something that harms the individual, it harms the family and the community. So he was on the sexual content team. He was reading a lot about sexual child abuse day in and day out. And his personality started to fundamentally change, but he was unable to explain to his wife and to his stepdaughter, her daughter from a previous relationship, why he was dramatically changing, because he didn't know how to say to her, I read sex content all day. That doesn't sound like a real job. ChatGPT hadn't come out yet. There was no conceptualization of what that even meant. And so one day she texts him and says, I would like fish for dinner. He goes out and buys 3 fish, one for him, one for her, one for the stepdaughter. And by the time he comes home, all of their things are gone. They've completely packed and left. And she texts him, I don't know the man you've become anymore. I'm not coming back.
It's absolutely grim, and just that it's harrowing reading. It really is. And the thing is that these companies are saying, well, we have to make AI aligned. We have to solve the alignment problem. We have to align them with human values. But it's their values. They get to decide what the values are.
Exactly. And so I originally reported that story when I was still at the Wall Street Journal, and OpenAI did actually respond to my comment request. They didn't ultimately participate in the book, but for the brief moment that they were talking to me, I said to them, you know, I laid out all of my reporting. I said, I interviewed this man, Mofa. I interviewed a bunch of other workers. Here are their experiences. And what OpenAI said was, this work is essential for serving our mission to benefit all of humanity. First of all, no, it's not essential. And I talk about that in the book. There are many different pathways of AI development that absolutely circumvent this need for this grotesque labor exploitation. But second of all, did you just tell me that you don't think these workers have humanity? I mean, that's the kind of imperial quality to it. That's when you really start to see the logic of empire, this idea that there are superior people in the world that have a God-given or a nature-given right to subjugate inferior people. And that's the only basis for arguing why these workers, who contributed just as much as the AI researchers working within OpenAI, were paid only a few dollars an hour, while the OpenAI researchers were being paid $1 million.
And they say things like, "Oh, we don't want to disrupt the local economy. We don't want to pay them anymore in case we,
Exactly.
yeah,
Exactly.
And it's not just the hidden labor. There's an environmental colonialism going on here as well, because this requires data centers and mining of minerals and all of these things. So that's a big issue, right?
It's a huge issue. So one of the things that I think has flown under the radar a lot is the scale and speed at which data centers are being built all around the world to support this training of Silicon Valley's conception of AI development, this growth at all costs conception of AI development. There was a McKinsey report that recently projected that in the next 5 years, if we keep up the current pace of computational infrastructure expansion, we will need to add 2 to 6 times the amount of energy consumed annually by the state of California onto the global grid in the next 5 years. And most of that will be serviced by fossil fuels. And we are already seeing reports of coal plants that were originally supposed to be retired that are now not being retired anymore, explicitly to power these data centers. There are reports of Elon Musk's xAI building the Colossus supercomputer in Memphis, Tennessee, and that being run on around 35 unlicensed methane gas turbines that are pumping thousands of tons of air pollutants into that community. So we're already talking about accelerating the climate crisis and accelerating the public health crisis for economically vulnerable communities. And then on top of that, Bloomberg recently did a story that showed that 2/3 of these data centers are actually going into water scarce communities as well. And one of the things to know about these data centers is they need to be cooled with fresh water, because anything that's not fresh water corrodes the equipment and leads to bacterial growth. And most often that means they're cooled with drinking water, because that's the infrastructure that's laid in these towns and communities to deliver fresh drinking water to businesses and residents. And so I interviewed a community in Montevideo, Uruguay, which was undergoing a historic drought. At the time, it was so bad that the Montevideo government started putting toxic wastewater into the public drinking water supply simply to have something come out of the taps when people were opening it. And for anyone who couldn't afford bottled water, that is what they were drinking. They were drinking toxic water, and women were having miscarriages because of this toxic water. And in the middle of that was when Google decided Montevideo is a great place to put a data center that is going to consume a lot of public drinking water. And so it is also exacerbating the freshwater crisis.
And when we talk and people have tried to put a figure on this, they say, oh, every time you use ChatGPT, that's 500 milliliters of water. And then you get pushback saying, oh, no, it's not that much. And then you go, well, actually, when you take into account that there's the data center, it's not just your prompt, it's all the training, it's all the stuff that goes on in the back, it's the data storage, it all adds up.
And it's also not just the volume of water, it's the distribution of water. Like that Bloomberg story is saying, like 2/3 of these communities don't actually have enough water. And so Uruguay is very much an early signal of what's going to continue to happen around the world.
It's not just in there as well. I mean, it's also coming to the UK too, right? So we've had talks of data centers in Kent, for example. There was lots of pushback there. There are when people, I think, when it starts coming on their own doorsteps, maybe then they start pushing back against it. We see resistance, and it's not just a case of NIMBYism. We can see the actual damage that this does to communities.
Yeah, and what's so interesting is, I mean, these are huge pieces of infrastructure. I went to Arizona to visit one of the data centers, and I tried to walk around it in extremely hot weather, and I ended up only making it around 2 of the legs before I was completely burnt to a toast, and then I had to flee back to my hotel into the AC. So these are massive pieces of infrastructure, and yet they're really hidden in plain sight, because the sites that they pick for building these data centers are places that don't have huge population centers. They're sort of tucked away and hidden.
And that's quite a deliberate thing for security reasons as well, right? So they're really high security too, because no one should get in to
yeah, exactly. There's many different reasons, both security and also they're trying to identify economically vulnerable communities. So it's most often rural communities. But then the impacts they have are not just on those communities. The impacts they have are on, there was reporting recently of a data center in Georgia where the economically vulnerable community greenlit it and said, yes, we want this data center because it's going to give us millions of dollars of upfront investment. But then it increased the utility bill for the entire state of Georgia. So people had their water prices jacked up, their energy prices jacked up. And then the pollutants, of course, and the climate acceleration also becomes a global problem.
And yeah, at the same time, the people who are building these, the people behind the companies, they have an almost religious fervor about the whole thing, about trying to reach artificial general intelligence, and their vision seems just almost religious. And it seems to be catching. So every week I get emails of ChatGPT transcripts from people who want to show me that they find something alive in the text. They want me to see that they've witnessed these conversations, and they claim they're interacting with things that are intelligent or powerful or even psychic. And this is quite different from the normal relationships that we tend to have with our technology, which tends to be about a willing suspension of disbelief. There are people out there who genuinely believe there's something transformative happening in terms of intelligence. So what did you come across for that?
Yeah, this was the thing that surprised me the most when reporting the book is, we hear the rhetoric all the time, AI is going to bring us to utopia, or AI is going to kill us all. in the AI world, people specify AGI is going to do one or the other. And I really thought it was rhetoric, in that in both of these narratives, the conclusion is that then this technology needs to be controlled very, very closely, and it must be controlled by the people who are developing it. And so it is a very self-serving narrative that OpenAI wheels out all the time. Anthropic, all of these other companies, they wheel out all the time when it's convenient for them to remind people why they're closed source, why that's better for everyone. The thing that I was shocked by is that it's not just rhetoric for some people. There are quasi-religious, as you mentioned, belief systems that have really developed within Silicon Valley, where people genuinely, it's not just the users of ChatGPT that develop these like quasi-religious relationships with their chatbots. It's the people that are developing it that have these quasi-religious beliefs, where they really think that, first of all, artificial general intelligence is definitely happening and it's right around the corner, which is actually a heavily scientifically contested idea. And second of all, that this will then have civilizational transformation either in the positive or negative direction. And most often they're called the boomers and the doomers, the boomers believing the utopia version, the doomers believing that AGI will kill us all. And, I talked to people in both camps that they were either like wide-eyed with wonder, or their voices were quivering, articulating to me their perception of what might happen in the future. And those were very visceral, emotional responses. And those ideologies really underpin a lot of this fervor around AI development today.
And they're anticipating this future that has AGI. And in order to get there, that they think, I don't believe it. I'm very cynical about reaching AGI this way, if at all. But to get there, they're going to need to scale, and they're going to need more data. They're going to need more compute. They're going to need more energy. And those are all in finite supply. And yet still the tech companies are promising that we will somehow get there. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, there was this New York Times article recently that just put it perfectly. It was written by Kate Metz, who's a very, very long time AI reporter, and the headline was why we're probably not going to get AGI anytime soon. And it cited this stat within the article of this study that was done of longtime AI researchers, well-respected AI researchers in the field, who 75% of them selected the option, we do not even think that we have the techniques available for AGI, even if that is even possible. And it was sort of a stark reminder of how distorted the public perception is from the true scientific one, because companies will engage in a lot of marketing and portray themselves as extremely scientific in their opinions, when actually they're just saying things that are good for their bottom line.
Yeah, I mean, I've yet to meet an academic in AI or cognitive science who thinks that we're going to reach AGI anytime soon. Some people don't think it at all, but it's very different from when I talk to people in industry, for sure. But about the future, in your book, you write that there's a different way forward, and it doesn't have to be what it is today, and we don't need to accept the logic of unprecedented scale and consumption to achieve advancement and progress. So my question is, how? What do we do? How do we get there? How do we resist this colonialism, this empire building, but still embrace AI? Because there is a note of positivity in what you write as well, that there are benefits to this technology, and it's not all doom and gloom, even though it sounds exactly like doom and gloom, because we've just talked doom and gloom for 15 minutes, 20 minutes.
Yeah, I think maybe I can first talk a little bit about like what would be these versions of AI that I do think are beneficial. So one of the things that was really amazing when ChatGPT, when I had the privilege of actually like truly learning about this technology and talking with academics who weren't just co-opted by companies and the work that they were doing, there was actually a trend at the time towards tiny AI models. And in fact, MIT Tech Review's annual 10 breakthrough technologies, I can't remember if we actually published this or I just submitted this as a pitch, but in like 2019, 2020, I submitted tiny AI as a breakthrough because there was this big shift in the research community realizing that you can get away with these teeny tiny data sets and small amounts of computational power, like just your cell phone, to train quite powerful models. But the key was you needed highly curated data sets, and you needed to apply these models to well-scoped problems that are more computational in nature, which is the strength ultimately of AI technologies. And so what I imagine as the vision for much more broadly beneficial AI development is this turn towards task-specific AI models that gets rid of the scaling problem and all of the harms that we talked about. Labor exploitation is a scaling harm. It only arises, you only need content moderation when you're pumping all of the internet into these models. And I quote an industry leader he's the CEO of Appen, one of the main providers of this contract labor to AI companies, explicitly saying the quiet part out loud. He was like, before we controlled the inputs, and now you put everything in and then you control the outputs. And it turns out that controlling the outputs means extraordinary amounts of labor exploitation. So if you descale, then you get rid of the labor exploitation, you get rid of the environmental harms, and then you also get rid of harms that arise when something is marketed as an everything machine when it's actually not. Like ChatGPT is a tool that does some things for some people, but when you pretend that it can do anything for anyone, then people start to use it in ways that it's not actually meant to be used, and that in and of itself is harmful. Like I see all the time users talking about using it as a therapist. It's not a therapist, you know, and those people are now being deprived of actual real psychological help for potentially really traumatic problems. And then the last aspect is I spoke with OpenAI researchers who would say to me, you know, because we don't know how people are going to abuse this technology or how it might harm people, the best way for us to just mitigate the harms is by first deploying it on everyone and then seeing how it harms people. And so there's this phrase that they coined called iterative deployment, where that's their strategy. They iteratively deploy their technologies, they observe what happens, and then they shore up the challenges. And they were explaining this to me as like, this is a feature, not a bug. Like this is the best possible way because we could not possibly imagine all of the ways it could go wrong. Again, that's only a problem if you're trying to make everything machines. But if you make a well-scoped system that has a bounded area in which it's supposed to be deployed and used, then you can actually anticipate how it might go wrong and shore that up in advance.
And actually, I want to pick up on that in terms of the therapy thing that you mentioned. So my work is around emotional and intimate interactions with technology and engagement. And therapy is the one that, I mean, you can see why people do it. It's incredibly compelling. We feel less judged if we talk to the machine. If we were able to do that with guardrails in place, if we were able to do that with proper clinical backing and interventions, that could be a really powerful thing. But then again, you worry about the knock-on implications of that. So does the government suddenly say, well, you've all got therapists now on your AI, we don't need mental health services anymore? So there's such a whole ecosystem around this stuff. But there's clearly potential to do so much better, but that doesn't generate power and money. So what we're hearing here is the problem is late-stage capitalism. No, said like the lefty academic that I am. But no, but this is the problem, right? We need if there's an element of control here that if we were to give that back to people, and that goes for data as well, really, that if we had more control over our own data. And I want to bring that at that point.
Yeah, so how do we
do it?
Get there? Yeah, so that the second part of the question, for me right now, I mean, as an American, there is a huge crisis of leadership at the top.
No
way. And so I used to be like, policy, and now I'm like, let's not wait for the policy because we don't know when it's going to happen and what on earth they're doing. And now it's very much, we need to govern from the bottom up. And the way that I see that happening is when you look at the full supply chain of AI development, which I really try to articulate in the book, there's the data, there's the land, energy, and water that go into producing these AI systems. And then there's spaces that these companies need access to deploy their AI systems, schools, hospitals, government agencies. And Silicon Valley has done a very good job of making people feel in the last decade plus that those resources and those spaces are actually Silicon Valley's, but they're not. They're ours. And so what I've seen is this amazing movement and momentum where people are starting to recognize this. Artists and writers are suing companies saying, no, you can't just take our intellectual property without giving us something mutually beneficial in return. And that is them reclaiming ownership of a key resource, a key input that goes into the production of AI. There are people that are demanding more privacy and using GDPR as a way to do that. There are people, there's students and teachers that are starting to have very lively debates about, should we actually just be wholesale adopting ChatGPT within our universities? Is that actually doing us good? How do we use AI in a way that fosters creativity and fosters critical thinking instead of eroding it? There are communities around the world that are pushing back, as we talked about, against data centers because those data centers are not giving them economic opportunity in the way that they thought they would. And so if we have, I see this as basically different sites of democratic contestation. If we have 100,000 times more of that energy where people are reclaiming ownership over key resources, key spaces, these companies will have to change over time.
And you don't even have to set fire to a self-driving car in the streets of San Francisco. It can be smaller than that. It's that pushing back, right? So you had a lovely example from New Zealand in your book.
Yeah, so in the epilogue, I write about this story that I originally published for MIT Tech Review about this nonprofit media organization in New Zealand called Te Hiku Media. They're a Maori radio station. And they really wanted to contribute to the revitalization of the Maori language because, like many indigenous peoples around the world, they started losing their language after generations of racist assimilation policies that didn't allow them to learn their languages in school. And the problem was they had this rich archive of Maori audio clips, and they wanted to connect it to Maori learners, but they needed a way to transcribe this because they wanted people to be able to listen to the sounds of their elders and then see the words being written out, and then they could create an interactive tool where the Maori learners could click on the different words and get a translation, and that would help facilitate and accelerate their language learning. But there weren't enough advanced Maori speakers to do this at scale and within a time that would make the resource helpful for this movement. And so they decided we should develop a speech recognition tool, an AI speech recognition tool. And the first thing they did, radical, they asked the community, do you want this AI speech recognition tool? And the community said, yes, we would love that. Then they said, will you donate data with fully informed consent to the production of this speech recognition tool? And they promised to their community, like, if you give us the data, we will guard that data. We will not use it for other purposes without your sign off. And so then over just a few days, with the full support of the community, they received hundreds of hours of audio transcription pairings. And that, just a couple hundred hours of audio, was enough to start training a relatively performant speech recognition model. And then they were able to start transcribing their audio archive, then feed that back into the speech recognition tool, continue to refine it. And they ultimately created this wonderful community resource for Maori language learners that reversed the effects of colonization rather than exacerbating it.
And I think one of the really lovely, poignant things about that is that so many languages are lost in AI, in the generative AI, because they haven't made it into the corpus that things are trained on, and they don't make it into the training data for the machine, and they get lost along the way. And so we find that most of the large language models are entirely based on English texts. And yet here they are creating something that works for them and is safeguarded by them. And I just think that's a very powerful example. It's lovely.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it really points to a new way to think about AI development that is sort of antithetical to how OpenAI or these other companies develop it. It's completely participatory, it's completely democratic, and they govern it responsibly, not just once the AI tool is developed, but all along the supply chain of that development.
If only our government will step up to the copyright debate and settle it for once and for all in the favour of the creatives. I'm biased. I want to open it to the floor now because I'm sure you have a lot of questions for Karen. Oh, look, hands are up already. There is a microphone that is going to come around, and I'm going to let, because I can't see beyond the beaming lights, I'm going to let the microphone wielders choose people. And so we will just listen for questions. There's some at the front as well.
Hello. I was wondering, I think one of the reasons that governments have really bought into, these massive investments in data centers and semiconductor chip plants and all these things is because AI is being, the story is that it's an arms race. It's the AI arms race. But as you said, AGI is a really contested term.
Yeah.
It's not like when we landed on the moon or we had the nuclear bomb that it happened, we know who won. So what are the governments racing towards? Do they even know? When is someone gonna win?
Yeah, I mean, no, I don't think the governments know what they're racing towards. But I mean, in the US, I don't know if this is the same in the UK, but the predominant entity, the evil empire that they're racing against is China. But I always say, look at the track record of what this argument has gotten us. I mean, the premise was if you do not regulate US companies at all, and you try to impose regulation through export controls on China, that somehow we will magically get much more democratic technologies and we will be able to have more rights and there will be more human dignity. And in fact, and also China will just totally recess and stop advancing in its AI development. In fact, the exact opposite has happened. Chinese companies have indeed been increasingly restricted in how much computational resources they have access to, and we ended up getting DeepSeek out of that, which is a model that was developed by a Chinese company called Highflyer, where they literally innovated around the computational restrictions, and that led to some really interesting techniques that now every company should be using to reduce the resource intensity on AI development. And they were the ones that completely open sourced their models. And now, companies in Silicon Valley are using DeepSeek in the back end to power their services. And at the same time, on the American side, we've just gotten more and more technology platforms that are having an illiberal effect on the world and eroding democratic rights, eroding human rights. And so that's my argument against this. Arms race narrative is actually literally just serving these companies that continue to espouse it.
Also, some at the front.
Hi, Karen. Thanks for that. I'm a political consultant, and I know you were sort of speaking up in favour of people power, but politicians like things simple and easy, preferably without costing anything. But if you could speak to Keir Starmer and say what's one thing the UK should do, I'd also be interested. The head of Anthropic recently said 1 in 5 white-collar jobs are going to go in the next 5 years. Was that just hype? Or should we be really worried about things like that? Thank you.
Great question. I'll maybe address the first one first, or so the second one first. It is hype in one sense, but I do think we need to take it seriously in the sense that jobs are not going to go away simply because AI models are capable of automating them. Jobs go away when executives of companies think that AI models are capable of automating them. So we already saw a case where Klarna just decided to get rid of a bunch of jobs and use AI services. And then it turns out a couple weeks later, they were like, oopsie daisy, we can't do that. But there will be plenty of companies that do that automation and realize the AI model still can't really do it, but they just stick to it anyway. It's good enough. We got a cheap version and we're just going to go with it. And so I do think that we will see significant impacts of AI on the job market. And in fact, we might already be seeing that. There was an article in The Atlantic that was looking at recent economic data, and there's a complete contraction of entry-level jobs. And, could be various different reasons why that contraction is happening, but one extremely strong contender is that it is actually companies that are starting to use AI instead of giving entry-level jobs to new college graduates, new young professionals. And that is highly predictable. Previous waves of automation did exactly that. When manufacturing was automated, it was the entry-level jobs that disappeared. And so the career ladder breaks. And even when there are new jobs created, there are higher skilled jobs and lower skilled jobs created, but only the people who jumped over the entry-level jobs have access to the higher skilled jobs, and everyone else ends up in the lower
And it usually
skilled
takes
jobs.
a generation for it to sort of settle again, doesn't it? Well,
Yeah.
certainly in the last few industrial revolutions, so it's been the case.
Yeah, exactly. So Dario Amodei, like, he was saying it to hype up the potential of the technology, but I don't think that the actual impact that this can have on job automation is hype in and of itself, irrespective of whether the AI technologies are capable. So in terms of like one thing that I would tell policymakers, I mean, I'll give a bit of a cheat answer in that this isn't necessarily one solution, but like we need way more transparency into what these AI companies are doing at every level. That means we need transparency into their data sets. Literally any benchmark of any AI model where we do not know what the model is being trained on is a totally bogus measure of the model's capabilities, because the entire premise of the so-called deep learning paradigm, which is all modern generative AI systems, is called test, train, split. You literally need to guarantee that your training data and your testing data are separate. And if you do not know what's in your training data, then you don't know if a model is being tested on exactly what it was trained on. So it gives you no real sense of its actual capability advancement. We need more transparency in the environmental harms and the data centers. There are data centers that literally enter communities under shell companies, and communities do not even find out that the data centers are being built there. So Meta entered New Mexico under the shell company named Greater Kudu LLC. And it wasn't until the deal was totally signed, they were like, surprise, we're Meta, and you're getting a giant data center that's taking all your fresh water. We need more transparency into the actual research or knowledge production around AI models by funding more independent institutions that can do essentially independent knowledge production outside of the empire, so that we know the true limitations of these technologies. These companies always censor the inconvenient truths. So that is the thing that I would say, like transparency all across the board. Yeah.
Oh, that would be nice. Who's next? That side somewhere? Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm revisiting Hannah Arendt's Banality of Evil at the moment. And I think that the question isn't just about how do we resist, but it's how are we not collaborating with this regime and with this empire right now? So if you could give us all some tips on ways that you would see us as being accidental co-conspirators with OpenAI, then that would be really helpful.
I usually don't say this, but I guess if you did not want to co-conspire, I would say don't use their technologies. I actually usually don't recommend this because it's so like case by case and like individual preference, but like I don't use ChatGPT, I don't use literally any of these tools other than to test out their new features so that I can write about them. And that's one of the ways that I think is the easiest to start not co-conspiring, because every time you use these technologies, you're giving them data that then leads them to be able to develop more capabilities that potentially automate you away. And so like with like journalism publications, in my industry, there are a lot of journalism publications that are deciding whether or not to strike partnerships with these companies. And many of them, they ultimately decide to strike a partnership, but also will write about them in in critical ways or like hold them accountable. And I'm like, you can't really do both, because you are kind of just feeding the beast. And ultimately these companies have so much power that inevitably, once they have enough data and can perform functions that seem journalistic, they can just pull back from the partnership, and they've already gathered all of the resource. And so it's not really like an effective way to feed the mouth with one hand and try to like use a stick with the other, you know? Beyond that, I mean, I've seen a lot of movements of people that are trying to figure out how just generally to, like artists, for example, they are masking their artwork with data poisoning techniques, where if a company trains on the data without their consent, it will actually just degrade the model's performance. And I think there are more and more researchers that are starting to look into kind of these tactics.
Yes, and Nightshade is one of them that does that. And then there's the tar pits thing online as well, where they fabricate links so that crawlers get caught in all the links and that aren't able to retrieve the data from websites. There's kind of a few nice little pushbacks.
Yeah.
I have a PhD student who works on AI and resistance, looking at different ways that people personally resist. And we ran this at a workshop. We said to people, what are your tips? And someone said, wear a watch. Because so many people are wearing smartwatches, just wear a regular watch. And I went back to wearing a regular watch. Don't look at the smart ring on my other finger. But I don't wear an Apple Watch or anything. But I just went back to like a nice analog watch. But there are choices to be made.
Yeah.
And I mean, I've heard of ones. There's an amazing professor at, I think she's at Princeton, Janet Fratesi, who does a lot on privacy, and she decided she wanted to take her kids to Disney, and it's one of the most surveilled places in the world apart from London, so the kids really wanted to go, so she ended up getting a hire car. They got burner phones. They did like dazzle makeup on the kids so that it would look, they couldn't recognize them, facial recognition. They sort of got as much analog as they could, and they did this whole, because her kids aren't online. The moment she got pregnant, she said, I'm not putting anything about my kids online. They're not even going to know I'm pregnant. So she had this whole kind of mission. I mean, it was like an absolute mission to get them to Disneyland or Disney World. I can't remember which one it was. So I guess, how far do you want to go with your resistance?
Yeah,
And,
that's amazing.
Yeah. People fighting back against things like facial recognition technology. We now in the UK have, I think there's now 3 police forces that use live facial recognition, even though we know that it is biased and flawed. And there are organizations that go out and monitor the use of that and push back. But there's a number of US cities that have banned it, especially in California and Massachusetts, the 2 main places that have a number of cities there. So there are ways we can object for sure. And I think we can, it doesn't have to be organized, it can be personal.
Yeah.
Anyone else? In the middle somewhere? They can fight over it. I can't see past these lights.
Hi, thank you. This has been a fascinating conversation. I want the good stuff that comes from AI. And the problem is we have to get it from all these slightly terrible companies.
Do we have to?
Well,
Why do you say that?
Well, so this is my question.
Okay.
I liked when you started at the beginning and you talked about the system of venture capital that created Sam Altman that then did that to OpenAI. So I work at a fund of funds. We have a mandate for systems change. So we're deeply interested in financial systems and how to make them better incentivized, better aligned, so on, to get good outcomes out the end. So I think as long as VC is, how do we make blitz scaling, all that stuff, how do we get as much money out of our investments as possible, we're always going to get the kind of OpenAI version. So is there a way that we can do the innovation piece, the VC piece, the whatever, that still makes money for the investors because that's what they're there to do, but also gives us good societal outcomes at the end?
It's a great question.
Simple question.
Yeah, very easy. Let's reinvent the VC, Silicon Valley model. I often find that the over-indexing on short-term gains in the long term is actually not sustainable. Even from the perspective of, this is drifting away from VC, but even from the perspective of companies that decide to automate away all their entry-level jobs, maybe short-term profitable, but long-term terrible. You didn't train any workers to then rise to the management level later on. And I think for VCs, there are, if you were an early mover to start investing in smaller scale AI systems, for example, I think that would be hugely profitable, because more and more companies, industries, people are going to hit upon the constraints of these AI systems. More and more people are going to start resisting these AI systems. Hopefully one day more regulators will start regulating these systems. And so if you invested early in other variations, that should take off. But I think, how do we get more VCs to do that? I don't know, but I do think that there is actually like a huge investment opportunity there where you wouldn't have to sacrifice gains and you can reallocate capital towards better uses.
Is this kind of thinking, the craft beer thing? Are we going to go towards the microbreweries of AI where we start seeing a premium pricing?
Yeah, yeah, because I mean, even I actually spoke with a startup like a year ago that they specifically were investing in smaller models because they were like, most companies don't want to pay. Most companies don't need everything machines. But then, so like, why are they paying 90% of an overhead cost for the 10% that they do need? So the startup identified early on, wait, let's just build specialized models for the 10% that different industries need. And they were actually doing quite well in raising money because they were one of the only movers that was doing that. And they also identified that like a lot of companies are starting to be more nervous about moving to the cloud. Some of them actually want to deploy on-prem solutions. So they shifted towards small scale models that are on-prem, and you can only do small scale models on-prem. You can't have industries just spinning up their own giant supercomputers to try and train these models. And so they identified like a real market opportunity that no one else was really thinking about. And moving into that space. So I do think that there are so many hidden market opportunities in the like small scale AI system, beneficial AI system direction that are just really, really explored right now.
And then you don't have to spend all your time undoing the crap that the large scale models have done and picking it all. Yeah, it's very tempting. More questions? Oh, some more in the middle. Oh, there's one at the back.
Thank you for the thought-provoking discussion. So I would like you to reflect a little bit on alternatives, and in particular in the realm of open source.
Yeah.
You haven't spoken about that. Obviously, OpenAI has kind of degraded the word open, but there is a lot of movement behind open source AI models, or are these really just different ways of empire building?
No, I don't think open source is a different way of empire building. I'm a huge fan of Hugging Face, the platform that aggregates a lot of open source models. I think open source is very much a way to resist the empire because it distributes the knowledge production. One of the benefits of open source is that researchers who do not work at the closed companies can actually do scientific research on generative AI models, for example, and actually understand what are the environmental costs of these models, what are the limitations in different ways, and how can we actually invent new techniques that reach the same level of capability, but with totally different data efficient, more computationally efficient approaches. It also allows for startups to actually be in the game. Like startups cannot, a lot of startups these days, they have become just wrappers on closed model companies where they plug into the application programming interface of one of the model providers. And then they have to ride or die with whether or not those monopolistic powers decide if those startups should continue to exist. And OpenAI has a history of bulldoze, like they get startups hooked onto their technology and then they bulldoze those startups over by releasing an update. And what they do is they use the initial startup adopters to collect a bunch of data on the industries that those startups operate in, and then they train it into their model. So open source also allows startups to independently develop robust business models on these technologies, and that enables more options for consumers around what AI vendors they want to use. So I do really think that it actually redistributes power rather than centralizing it.
Anyone else? That's a question over here. There's one on this side now, and then we'll come back to the middle.
Thanks. Thank you very much for the talk. Super interesting. My main question is about the use of the word empire. I find it interesting because historically the empires were the nation states, and then they chartered the LLCs to go do all the dirty work for them. But in this case, the empire is the LLC, and they don't have a nation or a state, and also the government kind of invests in them, but doesn't know if they can trust them. Like it's a very fraught relationship still, and the stocks of like, oh, we should be all in, oh, we should do none of it. Can you expand on that and your choice of really diving in on the empire word?
Yeah, so the analogy that I use, I don't use it in the book, but I've increasingly started using is the British East India Company, which The Anarchy, amazing book by historian William Dalrymple that talks about how the colonization of India was actually first done by company, not by the British Empire. And it started off very similar to the way that these companies started off today, where they actually first engage in mutually beneficial economic trade agreements with the Mughal Empire in India. And then as the British East India Company became more deeply entrenched in India's economic system, they gained significant leverage. They then gained significant political leverage. And eventually they reached a point where they became the apex predator of that ecosystem. And that's when they started acting as an imperial power and subjugated the Indian population for 200 plus years. And that like India actually formally becoming a colony of the British Empire. Eventually, because the company was actually quite weak at its foundations, which is, I think, another inherent feature of empires, is that they seem inevitable, but they're very, very weak at their base. That's when the British Empire nationalized the company, and then India became a colony of the British state. I see this playing out in real time right now with like the Trump administration also trying to declare that he wants to rebuild the American empire. So it's a state empire and then a corporate empire. They're both trying to use the other as their own, as an asset to their empire building ambitions. So you see this tenuous alliance, as you mentioned, where Sam Altman, previously Elon Musk, was trying to use the US government to get into more halls of power and install more of OpenAI's hardware and software all around the world, with the most recent deals being struck in the Middle East. And he's trying to use the Trump administration to essentially reach escape velocity. Like once these data centers are built, it's really hard to rip them out, even once the administration changes. And the Trump administration, in reverse, is trying to use Silicon Valley as its empire building asset by trying to put just more American technology all around the world and then use that as leverage against the EU, against countries in the global south, so on and so forth. And both of them are kind of in this state where they're trying to subsume the other. So like Silicon Valley, increasingly, there's this culture where the politics of exit has become really popular, which is this idea that democracy doesn't work anymore, and actually the best way of organizing society is just a series of networked companies with CEOs at the top. And so you see, like, that's the general direction that Silicon Valley is trying to head, where they're trying to eventually just get rid of this democratic governance structure, get rid of the state. And the state is trying to do what the British Empire did, nationalize these companies and eventually turn them into something that is a tool functioning for them. Yeah, so that's how I see the relationship between like corporate empire and state empire.
There's another question. There's one back there as well, and there's one at the front.
Hi
yeah,
there. Oh,
Yeah.
shall I go? Hi.
Oh, sorry. Where?
Hi.
At the back.
Oh, okay.
I was wondering where you think the whole quasi-religious, even, shall we say, cult-like mentality among Silicon Valley CEOs comes from. Is it simply because they drank their own Kool-Aid because it's easier to sell it that way? Or is it because they're really that far removed from what goes on in the supply chain? Because I'm a reporter as well, and I've been to one of your training things with Pulitzer, yeah. And I've been to the digital sweatshops in the Philippines, and it was quite apparent to me that AI could not work without the people who were on this side of the labor chain. So is it just because they're that removed from the reality on the ground? And my second question is, I'm wondering what you think of OpenAI's disrupting malicious uses of AI reports, where they apparently release and track ways in which the technology is being abused. Is that enough? Is there any thing problematic about this kind of these reports that they release? What are they leaving out? Yeah.
Yeah. On the first question, I mean, I think it's sort of a mix of different reasons that lead people to not kind of consider these supply chain harms. One, some of them are, yeah, deeply removed. Others of them, like going back to this idea that they genuinely believe it's possible to recreate human intelligence in computers. The most charitable way to frame this belief is if you put yourself in the shoes of these people where you could truly reach that point. The reason why some like the boomers think that this can bring us to utopia is because they see the world as inherently challenged because of humans' inability to cooperate, like on issues like climate change. You know, when I was talking with Ilya Sutskever, chief scientist, back in the day for my profile, he was saying like, we have not been able to solve climate change, not because we don't have the technologies, not because we don't have like the scientific consensus, but because ultimately like we lack human cooperation. So if we were able to fundamentally recreate these digital intelligences that didn't have cooperation issues, we'll just solve like all of the world's problems.
That's a totally engineer response.
Yeah, I mean, and so if you put yourself in the shoes of someone who really believes this, and the reason why they believe these things, by the way, is not because of a belief in the technology, what technology can do, but it's actually rooted in a belief of what the human brain and what human intelligence is. These people believe that human intelligence is completely computable. So inevitably you will recreate it if you just have enough data and enough computational resources. And one of the challenges of AI development throughout its decades is that there is no scientific consensus around what human intelligence is. There's no scientific consensus in biology, neuroscience, psychology. So this is just, once again, a belief. It's kind of a spiritual belief that we will inevitably get there, and it's going to have this like civilizational transforming positive or negative impact. And so if you actually think that we are just a few steps away from utopia, suddenly all costs become totally acceptable. So that's why they don't necessarily register this idea that there are harms happening now, because they think it will just magically go away. And the same thing is for the doomers. You know, the doomers, they think that if we make one wrong turn in this AGI development trajectory, that it will lead to everyone dying. And if you believe that, there is no other harm that can supersede the existential destruction of humanity. So once again, like any of the costs that are happening today are totally worth the ability to experiment and try and get to a point where AGI is quote unquote safe and no longer wants to kill everyone. And that is, yeah, I think that is the root behind their ideology. I think you had I remember you had a second question, but I've completely blanked. Oh, the malicious uses report. Yeah, I mean, no, that is not sufficient because, like, again, these companies censor everything they put out. So they often put out reports that suggest their technology is either amazing or harmful, all ultimately to serve the continued narrative that they need to control it. So that report is just another way of saying, and this is why we can't open source our technology, and that's why we're being super responsible by being a closed source company.
Okay, we've got one more question at the front here, please, because I haven't for a while. This is going to be the last question, I'm afraid, because we're running out of time.
Thank you so much. It's delightful to meet both of you. I think I send your work to people once every week for the last 5 years, so it's fantastic to meet you. My question is possibly reflective of my hope. It's again about the VC. So you mentioned the $40 billion funding round. When we're looking at the gap between the venture capitalists and the amount they've invested and the actual return on investment, and we're thinking about things like the possibility of model collapse, and the lack of actual traction that these tools get when they're bought and deployed in companies, is there a world in which it all burns down around them? And if that happens, what happens to all those digital labor companies, the people who work for them, the infrastructure they've built, and the impact it's having? Yeah. So if it all goes wrong, what then?
Great question. Yeah, I mean, it's extremely likely that the bubble's gonna pop. And I only say extremely likely and not like inevitably, because I don't believe that anything is inevitable. And I've been continuously surprised by how good Altman is at continuing to gather more fundraising and continuing to perpetuate the bubble. And there is a tiny fraction sliver of a probability that there is a world where the bubble doesn't pop, but I also think that that world could be devastating for a lot of people just the same. But you raised a really good point, which is like when the bubble pops, it's not actually the people at the top that suffer. And it's really just everyone else. And it's not just the people that are doing this work in these poor countries. It's also, like these investments are coming from, university endowments. They're actually the risk that VCs are putting on this technology is being inherited across the financial system. So when the bubble pops, like there will be ripple effects across the global economy.
And it may not. I think we're seeing a plateau of sorts. I think we're starting to see a little bit because every model that's been promised has not actually transpired.
Yeah.
And so it's slowing down for sure. Whether or not it actually plateaus is another thing. So it may not be a pop. It may just be a.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think the answer is that like when that happens, it would be devastating for many, many people, and that is why we all need to act now. And this is like if you take one thing away from this talk, it's that every one of you, everyone in the world has an active role in shaping the future of AI development, whether that means like looking up data centers around your community and then going to city council meetings and asking tough questions about that data center development, whether that means creating a student-teacher parent council in your kids' schools to create some sensible AI governance rules around the deployment of that technology in that school. Same with your companies, whether that means just opting out of all of the different platforms and not giving data. Like I deleted all my personal social media in part to stop giving data to these companies. So all of us need to actually, like, starting right now, think of all of the ways that we interface with the supply chain of the empire and latch on and slowly chip at it away.
I think that's an amazing message to finish on. And, when you hear that the future of AI is inevitable and the genie's out of the bottle and all of those things, it's not inevitable. It's not been written yet. And I think that's a perfect way to end it. So thank you so much, Karen.
Thank you.